The gavel struck the obsidian Zintabile like a death sentence, and Clara Wren felt the sound reverberate through the marble floor beneath her feet, through the soles of her worn black shoes, all the way up into her chest where it lodged itself like a splinter of ice. The court of Verath hereby strips Leander Belisar of all titles, territories, and blood rights granted under the ancient compact. The voice of High Arbiter Cassius Morvain rang through the vast underground chamber like a bell tolling for the dead. He is hereafter rendered nameless, his house is dissolved, his seat is forfeit, and should he remain within court boundaries beyond the hour of midnight, he shall be subject to the full penalty of blood law. Nameless, the word was a blade. Among vampires, losing one's name was not a metaphor, it was an erasure. A death of the self so complete that other vampires would look through you as though you did not exist, that your voice would carry no legal weight, that you could be destroyed without consequence or record. Clara stood at the back of the chamber, a silver tray balanced in her hands, a white cloth draped over her forearm. She was staff. She had been staff at Vereth House for 2 years. She polished the silver, she refreshed the blood crystal goblets at formal gatherings. She dusted the portraits of long-dead lords in the upper corridors, and she kept her eyes down and her opinions to herself, because that was what a human maid did when she worked inside a vampire court. But she could not keep her eyes down now. Leander Belisar stood at the center of the Chamber of Judgment, beneath a chandelier made of black antler and cold white flame, and he was the most devastatingly composed person she had ever seen in the worst moment of his life. He was tall, sharply so, with white hair that fell to his jaw in the way of old-world vampire aristocracy, like silver frost caught mid-fall. His skin was pale as alabaster, and his eyes were a deep, cold grey that Clara had always privately thought looked like the sky in the seconds just before lightning. He wore a black coat with silver lapels, the crest of House Belisar embroidered at the breast, though that crest now meant nothing. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his chin lifted, his jaw tight but not broken. He looked at the arbiter without flinching. He looked at the 7 seated judges without blinking. He looked at the assembled court members who lined the carved gallery above, some of them whispering behind gloved hands with expressions of barely concealed satisfaction, and he gave them nothing. No pleading, no rage, no visible grief. Only Clara, who had spent 2 years learning to read the silences of this house, saw the slight tightening around his eyes. The micro-fracture in his composure that lasted only a breath before the discipline of centuries sealed it shut again. The charges against him had been delivered the previous night, read aloud by a junior court herald in the kind of flat, careful voice that people use when they are afraid of the thing they are announcing. Leander Belisar had allegedly violated Blood Law 17, the ancient vow that forbade any vampire lord from forming unsanctioned alliances with human governing bodies outside the court's knowledge. Specifically, he was accused of meeting secretly with a division of human law enforcement to provide information about internal court movements. A traitor, they called him. A bloodbreaker. A man who had handed the secrets of his own kind to mortals for reasons the prosecution claimed were mercenary, though they had never produced evidence of what he had supposedly gained. Clara did not believe it for a single moment. She had worked in Leander Belisar's house for 2 years, and she had watched him. She was very good at watching. She had watched him dismiss a junior servant's debt without announcement or expectation of gratitude. She had watched him spend 3 silent hours reading in his study on the night of a court gala rather than attend a celebration he found distasteful. She had watched him step between a frightened kitchen girl and an intoxicated visiting lord with a calm and absolute authority that had made the visiting lord back down without a single word of violence. She had watched him, and she knew what kind of man he was. The kind that could not be bought, the kind that would not sell his people. The gavel struck again. This court is concluded. Guards, escort the nameless from the premises. And then something happened that Clara had not planned. She had not planned anything. She was a maid with a silver tray, standing at the back of a chamber where she had no voice and no power. But her mouth opened before her practical mind could stop it, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Long live King Leander. The chamber went utterly silent. It was not a whisper, it was clear, pitched to carry. The words falling into that silence like stones, dropped into still water, sending rings outward in every direction. People in the gallery above leaned forward. The 7 judges turned. High Arbiter Cassius Morvain fixed his pale, ancient eyes on her, with an expression that was not yet anger, but was building toward it the way a storm builds in the distance. Leander Belisar turned. He found her immediately, the way he always seemed to find her in a crowded room. As though she were a fixed point, his compass returned to without instruction. And for one fraction of a second, the composure cracked, not into grief, but into something rawer and more alive. Something that looked very much like he had been drowning for a long time, and had just heard a voice call his name from the surface. Then the guards reached her, and everything happened very fast. She had known, somewhere in the cold, rational part of her mind that never fully switched off, that saying those words would have consequences. Under blood law, a human who invoked royal title for a stripped lord was not simply dismissed. They were considered complicit in an act of court defiance. They could be detained. They could be questioned. In extreme interpretations of old blood law, they could be held as evidence of conspiracy. What she had not entirely calculated was that Leander Belisar would cross the chamber in 4 strides, put himself between her and the guards with the kind of speed that reminded you suddenly and viscerally that he was not human, and say in a voice that was quiet and total and brooking absolutely no argument, "Touch her, and I will burn this court to its foundation stones." He had been stripped of his title. He had been declared nameless. He had nothing left to lose. And the guards, who had presumably been briefed on the legal consequences of the evening and the political weight of the assembled court, looked at his face and stopped moving. High Arbiter Morvain rose from his seat, and he was old. Older than anyone in the room, old in the way that ancient vampires become old, with a quality of depth to him like looking down into very dark water. "You have been stripped, Belisar. You have no authority to obstruct court process." "I have no title," Leander said without turning. His eyes remained on the guards. "I have not surrendered my fangs." The threat was not elegant. It was not political. It was very, very clear, and the silence it produced told Clara everything she needed to know about what Leander Belisar still was, title or not. Morvain sat back down slowly. "Take them both to the lower holding rooms. We will determine the appropriate charge in the morning." That was the night Clara Wren stopped being a bystander in the story of Leander Belisar, and the story, as she would come to understand it in the weeks that followed, had been building for a very long time before she said those 3 words. The holding rooms beneath Verith Court were not the dungeons of horror novels. They were simply rooms with no windows, thick walls, and a lock on the outside that operated by blood key rather than metal. Clara had been in them once before, helping to deliver a meal tray to a detained member of a visiting delegation, and she remembered thinking they felt less like cells and more like the inside of a very expensive box. Cold, silent, elegant in a stripped-down way, and entirely inescapable. They put her in one room and Leander in an adjacent one, with a wall between them that was solid enough to make conversation difficult, but not impossible, if you pressed close to the shared surface and spoke with deliberate care. Clara discovered this approximately 20 minutes after the lock engaged, because she heard something tap the wall with a measured pattern, 3 short, 2 long, 1 short, and she recognized it instinctively because it was Morse code. And she had learned Morse code at 14 from a book about radio operators during the Second World War, because she had always believed that knowing strange and obscure things was never wasted. She pressed her palm flat to the wall and tapped back, 2 short, "I hear you." A pause. Then his tap pattern came again, slower, more deliberate, and she translated it in the quiet of her mind. "Are you hurt?" She almost laughed. She pressed her fingers to the stone and tapped back. "No. Are you?" His response was immediate. "No." And then after a beat, a longer sequence that took her a moment to pass because the rhythm was more complex, it spelled, "You were very foolish." She tapped back without hesitation. "I know." Another pause. Longer this time. Then, "Thank you." She pressed her forehead against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes and breathed, and decided not to examine too carefully why her chest felt full of something warm and aching at those 2 simple tapped-out words. The morning brought High Arbiter Morvain, who arrived without guards, which Clara took to mean he wanted a conversation rather than a confrontation. He was taller than she had expected when seen at close range, and he smelled of cold iron and old paper, and his eyes were colorless, like frosted glass, which was unusual even among vampires. He stood in the center of her holding room, and he studied her with the kind of patient attention that told her he had interviewed a very great number of people over a very long time, and found most of them disappointing. "Clara Wren," he said, "you have worked in this house for 2 years. You have an unremarkable service record. You have never drawn attention of any kind until last night." He paused. "Why did you say what you said?" Clara considered lying. She was intelligent enough to construct a convincing one, and she was not above practical deception in a dangerous situation. But she looked at Morvaine's colorless eyes and understood that he was old enough to smell dishonesty the way other people smelled smoke, and a bad lie would do her far more damage than a careful truth. "Because he did not do what they accused him of," she said, "and someone should have said so." Morvaine studied her for a long, quiet moment. "You are very certain of that?" "Yes. On what evidence?" "On 2 years of observation," she said. "I know what he is. He is not a man who sells his people." Something shifted in Morvaine's expression, something she could not entirely read, because he was very old and very controlled. "Do you know what actually happened, Miss Wren? Do you know why Leander Belisar met with the humans he is accused of meeting with?" She did not. She waited. Morvaine was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "He was trying to protect a human intelligence operative who had been fed false information about our court by a faction of our own council. The operative was going to publish information that would have triggered a crisis between our kind and the human governing bodies. Leander moved to contain it before it became irreversible." He paused. "Without telling the court, because the faction feeding false information included 3 members of this court's inner council." Clara stared at him. "Then the charges against him were brought by the very people he was working to expose," Morvaine said, and there was something in his voice now that she finally identified as anger, cold and controlled but present like a coal banked low in the bottom of a furnace. He was outmaneuvered. They moved faster than he anticipated. By the time I understood the full shape of what had happened, the trial had already concluded and the vote had already passed. He looked at her steadily. "Your declaration last night was, legally speaking, a defiant act. Practically speaking, it was the first public acknowledgement of his loyalty that has been spoken inside these walls since the accusations were made." Clara was very still. "What happens now?" "That depends," Morvaine said, "on what you know and whether you would be willing to repeat what you have just said to me in a formal setting with a court recorder present." He studied her face. "The 3 inner council members who brought charges against him are Valdris Son, Lady Eskerith Vale, and Lord Brennan Myrock. They are currently untouchable because they hold majority block. To challenge them, I need a procedural lever. What Leander did was not sanctioned, but it was not a blood law violation. He used a technical loophole in the compact language. The correct charge, if any, would be unauthorized independent action, which carries a formal reprimand, not stripping. But to reopen the trial, I need a formal complaint of procedural misconduct." He tilted his head slightly. "Lodged by any party, including a human staff member who was present for the proceedings and believes the proper legal standards were not met." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You need me to give you the mechanism." "I need someone to give me a lever," Morvaine said. "You have, apparently, decided to take a position in this matter. I am asking whether you would like it to be effective." She thought of Leander's face when he turned and found her. She thought of the 2 tapped words against a stone wall in the dark. "Thank you. Tell me exactly what to sign," she said. The formal complaint was filed at 9 o'clock in the morning by Clara Wren, household staff, on the grounds that the trial of Leander Belisar had not provided the accused with adequate opportunity to present counter-evidence under the 3rd provision of the ancient compact, which guaranteed any vampire lord facing title stripping the right to a full 3-day evidentiary period rather than the single-session hearing that had been conducted. It was a technicality. It was a small, quiet procedural thing. But Morvaine had been right. It was a lever, and when you pressed it correctly against the right fulcrum, it could move enormous weight. The Council of Verith was legally obligated to respond to a formal compact complaint within 48 hours. Leander was released from the holding room pending procedural review. Clara was released as a witness, not a prisoner, and the 3 inner council members who had engineered the stripping suddenly found themselves under a procedural audit that they had not anticipated and could not easily dismiss. They released Leander into a kind of limbo. He was not restored. He was not exiled. He existed in a grey corridor of no title but no legal sentence while the review proceeded, and he moved through Verith House in that state with the same absolute composure he had shown in the Chamber of Judgment, except that his composure now had a different quality to it. It was not the composure of a man waiting for an outcome. It was the composure of a man who had decided something, and was operating from a place of quiet, settled resolution. He found Clara at the end of that first day in the east corridor of the house, where she was replacing the white tapers in the wall sconces with fresh ones, because the court has still required its candles changed at dusk, regardless of any political upheaval occurring beneath its roof. She heard his footstep on the marble behind her and knew it immediately because she had catalogued the sound of every person's step in this house as a matter of practical habit. "Miss Wren," he said. She turned. He was very close. In the corridor light he looked like something out of a painting, white-haired and pale and precise, and his grey eyes had something in them that she did not have a word for, but that made her very careful about where she put her own eyes. "Lord Belisar," she said. "I am not a lord at present," he said. There was no bitterness in it. It was simply a statement of current fact. "I know," she said, a pause. He looked at the candle in her hand, then at her face. "What you did in the chamber, what you said," he stopped. "I need you to understand that I did not ask you to do it. I did not expect it. I would not have permitted you to place yourself in that position if I had known." "I know that too," she said. "It was dangerous. Yes, and foolish. You already tapped that through the wall," she said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile because it was too restrained and too complicated for something as simple as a smile, but it was in that direction. And it shifted his face in a way that made him look, briefly, less like an ancient aristocrat and more like a person. "I did," he said. "I also tapped thank you. I know." Another pause, longer than the first. She turned back to the sconce and fitted the fresh candle into its holder with hands that she was proud to note remained entirely steady. "Why?" he said. Not aggressively, not with entitlement. Quietly, genuinely. As though the answer mattered to him in some personal way that had nothing to do with legal strategy. She finished fitting the candle before she answered. She thought about several things she might say. She thought about the truth in its various layers, and she chose the one she was most comfortable offering. "Because what was happening was wrong," she said. "And I was there, and I could say so, so I did." She felt him watching her for a long moment. Most people in your position would have kept their eyes down and been glad it wasn't them. "I know," she said again. "Most people probably would have." She moved to the next sconce. He did not follow immediately, but after a moment he fell into step beside her, at a distance that was not close enough to be inappropriate by any ordinary measurement, but that felt, somehow, like a kind of deliberate proximity. Like he had chosen the distance carefully, and this was where he had placed himself, and he intended to remain there. "The review will take 3 to 5 days, he said. "Morvain tells me you filed the complaint. He needed a lever. And you provided one," he explained the situation to me. It seemed the practical thing to do, another of those almost smiles. "The practical thing," he repeated. "Is that how you would characterize calling me king in a room full of vampires who had just voted to erase me?" She reached the next sconce. "That part was not practical," she admitted. "That part was something else." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was lower and more careful, like someone handling something fragile. "What was it?" She looked at him then, directly, which she did not do often because his eyes were the kind of eyes that required you to brace yourself first. "It was honest," she said. He held her gaze for a beat, 2 beats, 3, and something moved through his expression that she could not name precisely, but that she felt in her sternum like a struck chord. Then he inclined his head, just slightly, the way old-world vampires inclined their heads when they were acknowledging something of significance. "It was," he said. It was the most honest thing I have heard in this building in a very long time. They were not safe, either of them. She understood this clearly in the days that followed. Valdres Son was the eldest of the 3 council members who had engineered the stripping, and he was not a man who lost with grace. He was thin and angular, with black streaked silver hair and eyes the color of dried blood, and he had a habit of showing up in unexpected places at unexpected times in the way of a creature that has had centuries to perfect the art of unsettling people. He appeared at the end of the kitchen corridor one morning, when Clara was carrying supplies from the store cupboard, and he stood there watching her until she reached him, and had to stop because he was blocking her path. "You are the human who spoke in the chamber," he said. "Yes," she said. "Brave," he said, in a tone that made brave sound like a variety of stupid. Or perhaps not brave, perhaps instructed. "No one instructed me." "Did Morvain approach you before the trial?" His eyes were flat and assessing. "Did he plant a strategy in advance?" "The complaint you filed has his fingerprints on it in structure, if not in name." "I spoke in the chamber before Morvain spoke to me," she said. "You can verify that against the sequence of events. The complaint came afterward, after he explained the situation to me, and I chose to act." She met his flat gaze steadily. "I chose. Not him. Not Lord Belisar. I chose." Son looked at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. He was testing her for fear she understood. She was afraid, but she had decided some years ago that fear was information, not instruction, and she declined to let it instruct her in this particular moment. "Human women who insert themselves into vampire court, matters rarely come out of it, improved," he said. "Is that a threat?" she said. "Because if it is, I would like to note the time, the location, and the precise wording for my own records." Something moved in his expression, and she thought it might be surprise. People who used fear as a tool were often genuinely startled when it failed to land. He turned and walked away without another word, and Clara set down her supply box very carefully, pressed her hands flat against the corridor wall for a moment until they stopped shaking, and then picked the box back up and continued on her way. Leander was in the East Library when she found him, which was where he spent most of his days during the review period. Because the library was one of the few rooms where the limbo of his current status did not feel like an indignity. He was at the long reading table with a stack of documents, and he looked up when she came in. She set the supply box down inside the door and told him about Son. He was on his feet before she finished the second sentence, and the quality of stillness that came over him was not calm. It was the stillness of something very large and very dangerous making a decision about whether to move. "He threatened you." "He implied something vague and menacing," she said. "It was not specific enough to be actionable. I will make it clear to him that you are not to be approached." "You cannot," she said. "You have no authority to make anything clear to anyone at the moment, legally speaking. Anything you say to him could be used as harassment of a council member and complicate the review." She paused. "Morvain needs this review to proceed cleanly. We cannot give Son an excuse to muddy the water." He looked at her with something she could only describe as restrained fire. "You would have me do nothing." "I would have you do nothing that makes things worse," she said. "Which is different from nothing. It is, in fact, the harder thing." He was silent for a long moment, and she could see the effort it cost him, not the restraint itself, but the acknowledgement that the restraint was correct, that the strategic patience was the right tool, even though every instinct he had was pulling in the opposite direction. "He frightened you," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, "he did. And you came here anyway and told me calmly." "Being frightened does not prevent me from thinking," she said. "It makes it harder but not impossible." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he crossed the room and stood in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head up to hold his gaze, and he said in a low, deliberate voice, "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. In 2 years of sharing a house, she had always been Miss Wren. Now she was Clara, and the word in his voice sounded different than it did anywhere else, weighted with something that had nothing to do with professional courtesy. "If anyone in this court harms you in any way," he said, "regardless of the review, regardless of the legal situation, regardless of what strategic patience requires, I want you to understand that there is no version of events in which I will not respond to that." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "I have always known that." He looked down at her for another moment, and then he did something that surprised her. He raised one hand and tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face, very slowly, very deliberately, as though he had been thinking about doing it for some time and had decided that the situation warranted it. His fingers were cool against her skin, very cool, and she did not step back. "Good," he said softly. "Then we understand each other." They did. And in the days that followed, that understanding deepened in ways that neither of them named, but both of them felt with increasing clarity. She brought him tea because he could not drink blood from court sources during the review. A procedural isolation that was part of the compact's neutrality requirements, and the alternative was the sealed blood stores in his personal quarters, which he found distasteful to rely on while he was effectively a guest in his own house. And she brought him tea because it gave him something warm and normal to hold, and because she had noticed in 2 years that he held warmth the way a person holds warmth when they have been cold for a very long time. He accepted it without comment the first time. The second time he said, "Thank you." The third time he wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her over the rim with those storm-grey eyes and said, "How did you know I preferred it without sugar?" "I pay attention," she said. "You pay a great deal of attention," he said. "It is useful," she said. "To your work?" "To everything," she said. He looked down at the cup. "What else have you noticed?" he said. And his voice was quiet and careful in the way it was when he was asking something real. She sat down across from him, which she would not have done 2 weeks ago, not because she was not permitted, but because the social distance had felt appropriate. It did not feel that way anymore. "I have noticed that you dislike the court's social gatherings, but attend them because that you believe presence is a form of governance. I have noticed that you read for pleasure and that your taste runs to histories of human wars, which I find interesting, given that you have lived through several of them. I have noticed that you are more comfortable with silence than with novice, which is why this library is where you come when things are difficult. I have noticed that you are significantly kinder to the household staff than to anyone with a title, which I believe is a reliable measure of a person's actual character." She paused. "And I have noticed that you have been lonely for a very long time." He did not answer immediately. He looked at the cup hands and was quiet in the way he was quiet when something had reached him in a place he had not been expecting to be reached. "That is a considerable amount of noticing," he said finally. 2 years, she said. "I have had time." He looked at her then, and his eyes were unguarded in a way she had not seen before, the careful ancient armor gone for a moment, and what was underneath it was not weakness. It was something far more difficult than weakness. It was longing, old and settled and present, the kind that has been sitting in a person for so long it has become part of the architecture of their interior life. "Clara," he said, "I am currently without title, without legal standing, and facing a procedural hearing that may or may not restore either. I am in no position to—" He stopped. "To what?" she said. He set the cup down. He looked at her with those open, unguarded eyes. "To tell you that in 2 years of isolation within this court, you are the only person who has felt like company," he said. "To tell you that when I turned and saw you in that chamber, I felt something that I have not felt in a very long time, which was not gratitude, though there was gratitude. It was something older and more inconvenient and considerably harder to be strategic about." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something complex and vivid inside her chest. "Say it plainly," she said. "You have lived long enough to know that plain speech saves time." Something broke open in his expression, and it was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are real and unguarded and have no interest in being anything other than what they are. "I am falling in love with you," he said, "and I am aware of the timing, and I would like it noted that I find the timing extremely inconvenient." She laughed. It was not the laugh she had expected to produce in this moment, but it came out genuine and warm, and he looked startled by it in the best possible way, as though he had forgotten what laughter felt like in a room where he was present. "I find it inconvenient too," she said. "I have been finding it increasingly inconvenient for approximately 6 months. 6 months, he said. "And you gave no indication. You were a vampire lord and I was your maid," she said. An indication seemed inadvisable, and now... Now you are a vampire without a title, and I am a human who has committed procedural defiance on your behalf in front of your entire court, she said. The power dynamics have shifted considerably. He reached across the table and took her hand, and his fingers were cool and careful and entirely sure of themselves, which was very like him. I am going to get my title back, he said. When the review concludes, when the evidence is presented, when the council members who manufactured those charges are exposed, I will be restored. And when I am restored, I will still feel exactly this. He tightened his hand around hers. I need you to know that it is not the stripping that has produced this. It was already there. The stripping simply removed the obstacles to my saying so. I know, she said. I have been watching you for 2 years. I know. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles in the old world way. Slow and deliberate, and waited with everything they had not yet said. And she felt the cool touch of it travel from her hand all the way through her and lodge somewhere permanent. The review hearing was set for 3 days after that, and it was in the 48 hours preceding it that things became dangerous in a way that was less political and more immediate. Valdris Son had not been idle. He was old and experienced, and he had not survived as many centuries as he had by losing procedural battles without attempting to change the battlefield. Clara became aware of his alternative strategy on the second of those 2 days. When she intercepted a conversation she was not meant to hear, she had been moving through the service corridor behind the main hall, which ran parallel to Son's private meeting rooms, and shared, in one thin stretch, a wall that was less acoustically sound than the rest of the building, due to a pipe conduit that had been installed in the 1920s. She had known about this architectural quirk for months. It was the kind of thing you learned when you cleaned every surface of a building for 2 years. She slowed her step and she listened. Son was speaking to Lady Eskerith Vale, whose voice was distinctive, very smooth and very cold, like ice forming over moving water. They were discussing this human witness, which was what they called Clara, and the nature of their discussion made her mouth go dry. They were not planning to discredit her testimony. They were planning to remove the need for it. There was a blood law provision, ancient and rarely invoked, that stated that testimony provided by a human in a vampire court proceeding could be challenged on the grounds of coercion if the human in question had a demonstrable personal connection to the defendant. The definition of personal connection was broad enough in old legal language to encompass emotional attachment, and they had, apparently, been watching Clara and Leander with considerable attention and had drawn accurate conclusions. If they could demonstrate before the hearing that Clara's testimony was motivated by personal feeling rather than objective opposition, they could have it struck from the record and reframe the complaint she had filed as a compromised act. More than that, under an obscure emergency provision of the blood law, a human deemed to have formed an unauthorized bond with a vampire under court jurisdiction could be removed from court premises permanently and banned from providing any further testimony, evidence, or formal statement in any related matter. They were going to have her expelled before the hearing. Clara replaced her very cold fear with an equally cold plan and moved quickly back through the service corridor. She found Morvain first. She told him everything she had heard in precise, ordered sentences with accurate quotations as far as she could produce them. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The provision they intend to invoke is the Havel provision, he said. It was last used in 1887. It is legitimate law, but it requires a formal declaration of unauthorized bonding, which must be seconded by 2 council members. Son and Vale can second each other. Miroc will likely provide the third voice if needed. He paused. The provision requires the declaration to be filed with the court recorder at least 4 hours before any proceeding it is intended to affect. The hearing is tomorrow at 10 in the morning. They will need to file by 6. Clara looked at the clock on the corridor wall. It was just past 3 in the afternoon. How long does it take to file? 20 minutes for a declaration of that type, he said, which means they are almost certainly filing it now or within the next hour. Can we block it? No, he said. We cannot block a legitimate legal filing, but we can respond to it. He looked at her steadily. The response provision to the Havel provision is the Compact's article of willing association, which states that an unauthorized bond cannot be declared against a human who has been formally acknowledged as a court-recognized companion by the vampire in question. The acknowledgement must be voluntary, witnessed, and recorded before the Havel Declaration takes effect. She understood immediately. Leander would need to formally acknowledge me as a recognized companion, Morvain said, which is a significant formal designation under vampire court law. It carries specific legal protections and specific legal obligations. It is not taken lightly. He paused. I must tell you that I cannot advise either of you on whether to do this. It is a personal decision of considerable weight. It would also need to happen within the next 2 hours to precede the filing. She looked at him for one moment. Then she went to find Leander. He was at his quarters, not the library, which told her he had been managing the weight of the waiting period in the only room that still felt fully his. She knocked and he opened the door, and she told him everything in the same precise, ordered sentences she had used with Morvain, and she watched his expression move through several things very quickly. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You came to me immediately." "Obviously," she said. "You did not try to handle this alone." "I handled Morvain alone," she said. "You are the next step." He looked at her. "The Article of Willing Association is not a small thing," he said. "A court-recognized companion designation is permanent under the compact. It cannot be revoked by either party without a formal proceeding. It carries legal standing. It means that wherever I exist within the court's jurisdiction, you are recognized and protected. It means I am legally accountable for your safety and well-being under blood law." He paused. "It means that if I am restored, you would be acknowledged at court level, and if I am not restored, you would be associated with someone who carries no legal standing." "I understand," she said. "It is not equivalent to the human institution of marriage," he said carefully. "But it is not entirely unlike it, and I would not have you enter it without understanding what it is." "Leander," she said, and his name in her mouth had a different texture now than it had when she had first used it, layered with everything that had happened between them. "You told me 3 days ago that you were falling in love with me. Were you telling me the truth?" "I was," he said. "Then stop explaining the document to me," she said. "Do you want to do this?" He looked at her for a long, charged moment. Then something in his face settled into a kind of quiet, absolute certainty that she had seen in him once before, in the chamber of judgment, when he had stepped between her and the guards with nothing left to protect him but his own nature. "Yes," he said. "I have wanted something like this since, before I had a name for what I wanted. I want to protect you. I want to be the person you bring difficult problems to. I want to stand between you and Valdris Son and every other ancient threat that has the poor judgment to direct itself at you." A pause. "And I want to drink tea in the library with you for as long as you will allow it." She felt something large and luminous move through her chest. "Then let us go file the correct paperwork," she said. They filed the Article of Willing Association at 4:15 in the afternoon, witnessed by Morvain himself, who signed the formal record with the gravity appropriate to the act. Son's Havel Declaration was filed at 5:20, landing 45 minutes after the article had already been recorded. When the court recorder informed Son's representative that the Havel provision could not be applied to a formally recognized companion, the silence from Son's officers was the most satisfying sound Clara had heard in a very long time. The review hearing took place the following morning in the same chamber of judgment where Leander had been stripped, which felt deliberate on Morvain's part, and Clara suspected it was. The evidence Morvain presented was methodical and devastating. He had spent the days since the complaint was filed pulling records that Son's faction had assumed were too old or too buried to be retrievable, finding witnesses within the court's own infrastructure who had seen or heard things they had not been asked about during the original trial, and building a case that demonstrated not only that Leander had not violated blood law, but that the charges against him had been constructed by a coordinated effort involving Son, Vale, and Mirok working in concert with a faction of the human intelligence community that had wanted both Leander and the accurate intelligence he was protecting removed from the equation simultaneously. The human operative Leander had been trying to protect came forward to provide a recorded statement, delivered remotely, corroborating every significant point of Morvain's case. Clara sat not in the back of the chamber this time, but at a table designated for court-recognized and companions, which was a position she had not known existed until that morning, placed to the left of the primary floor, visible to the full assembly above. She was still wearing her own clothes, dark and simple, not the clothes of a court dignitary. She had thought about this and decided it was appropriate. She was what she was. A human woman who paid attention and told the truth and chose her moments. The table gave her the legal standing to be present. Who she was gave her the right to look everyone in that gallery directly in the eye, and she did. Leander stood at the center of the chamber again, in the same position he had stood during the stripping, and the symmetry was not accidental. He looked the same as he had that night, white-haired and pale and impossibly composed. Except that this time, when his eyes found Clara across the chamber, they did not have the fracture in them. They had something else, something warm and settled and sure, and she held his gaze for a moment before they both turned their attention back to the proceedings. When Morvain finished presenting, the 7 judges deliberated for a period that felt much longer than it was. Then the senior judge, a small, ancient woman named Perditha Call, who had said nothing during the first trial, and whose silence had apparently been deliberate choice rather than agreement, spoke in a voice that was quiet and absolutely final. The evidence presented demonstrates that the charges filed against Leander Belisar were manufactured through procedural manipulation by members of this court's inner council, specifically Valdris Son, Lady Escarith Vael, and Lord Brennan Murrock. The trial of record was conducted under false pretenses, which constitutes a fundamental violation of the ancient compact's due process provisions. This court rules that the stripping of Leander Belisar's title, territories, and blood rights is hereby declared null and void. All rights and designations are restored in full, with immediate effect. She paused. Furthermore, the actions of Son, Vael, and Murrock constitute blood law violations of the highest order. This court refers the matter to a formal tribunal under compact authority, pending which the 3 parties are suspended from council activity. Another pause. The court recognizes, for the record, that the procedural complaint that enabled this review was filed by Clara Wren, court-recognized companion, whose intervention made this correction possible. The chamber was silent for a moment. Then it was not silent, because the gallery above broke into the kind of noise that happens when a large group of people who have been holding their breath finally hail together, some of it approving, some of it troubled, all of it alive, in a way the chamber had not been during the original proceeding. Leander did not react publicly. He inclined his head to the bench, turned, and walked across the chamber floor toward Clara, with unhurried, measured steps, and the entire gallery watched him do it, which was, Clara suspected, entirely intentional. He stopped in front of her table and looked down at her with those storm-grey eyes, and said, quietly enough that it was only for her, "Thank you." "You already tapped that," she said. "I intend to keep saying it," he said, "for a significant period of time." She stood up from the companion's table and they walked out of the chamber of judgment together, and for the first time in the weeks of upheaval and procedural combat and careful navigation of ancient law, Clara felt something that was not tense or tactical or managed. She felt, simply, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Son's tribunal took several weeks to complete. He attempted in the interim 2 further procedural maneuvers and 1 direct approach to Leander that was dressed as a negotiation, but that was transparently an attempt to discover whether a deal could be struck that would soften the tribunal's eventual findings. Leander received him once in his study, with Clara present, which he noted was not negotiable. Son looked at her across the desk with that flat, blood-colored gaze, and said nothing about her presence, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how significantly the legal landscape had shifted. "I want to discuss terms," Son said. "There are no terms," Leander said. "This is not a negotiation. This is a courtesy notification that I will be providing full cooperation to the tribunal, and making no recommendation toward leniency." His voice was calm and final in the way of someone who has already made a decision and has no interest in revisiting it. "You manufactured charges against me to cover your own violations of the compact and to prevent me from exposing what you had done. You placed a human operative in danger. You attempted to use ancient law to silence a woman's who had the courage to speak the truth in a room where it was unwelcome. You have had 6 centuries to develop better judgment, and you have elected not to. He paused. I think we are finished here. Son left without another word. Clara watched him go and felt the door close behind him, and thought that the sound of it was very clean and very complete. Are you satisfied? She asked. No, Leander said. I will be satisfied when the tribunal removes him from this court permanently. But this particular conversation is finished, yes. He looked at her across the desk. In the weeks since the restoration, they had found a rhythm together that was neither the professional distance of the previous 2 years, nor the acute urgency of the review period. It was something more settled, something that had the feeling of permanence about it. And Clara had spent some time examining how she felt about permanence, and had arrived at the conclusion that she felt very good about it indeed. Clara, he said. Leander, she said. I want to talk to you about something that has nothing to do with son or tribunals or blood law. All right. He came around the desk and stood in front of her, and she understood by the way he was standing, that careful, deliberate posture that meant he had been thinking about something for some time and had decided to stop thinking and start speaking, that this was one of those moments that would matter. I am 382 years old, he said. I have held titles and lost them and held them again. I have built and watched things collapse and built again. I have spent most of those years inside institutions, inside courts, inside structures of power, and I have found those structures useful, but I have not found them meaningful. He paused. I have found you meaningful. She looked up at him. I am 28 years old, she said. I have worked for people who did not see me and been invisible in rooms where I had every right to be present. I have been practical when I wanted to be passionate and careful when I wanted to be brave. And I have spent 2 years watching you and knowing something important was happening that I was not permitted to name. She held his gaze. I want to name it now. Name it, he said, low and quiet. I love you, she said. I love you, and I am not afraid of what that means, and I am not afraid of you, not of what you are, or what your world requires, or how long you have lived, or what living that long has made you. I am not afraid. She paused. I am only afraid that you will decide this is too complicated or too weighted with difficulty, or that I am too temporary by your measure of time. He reached up and took her face in both of his cool, careful hands, and she felt the touch all the way through her. You called me king when I had nothing, he said, when every voice in that room was either silent or against me. You stood in the back of that chamber with a silver tray, and you spoke the truth, and you did not flinch. He brushed his thumb gently across her cheekbone. Nothing about you is temporary to me. Do you understand that? You are not something that happened while I was between one chapter and the next. You are not a footnote to the restoration. You are why the restoration matters. You are the thing I was restored to. She felt the full weight of those words settle over her like something warm and real and permanent. That is a significant thing to say to a human maid, she said. You are the court-recognized companion of a restored vampire lord, he said, with a trace of that not quite smile that she had come to love. I believe the designation has evolved somewhat. She reached up and covered one of his hands with hers. Kiss me, she said, and then we can argue about designations. He kissed her, slowly and without any of the restraint that had characterized the previous weeks, and it was the kind of kiss that settles something, that puts something into place that has been waiting to be placed. And she felt it in every part of herself. This cool, careful ancient man who kissed her like she was the most important thing in 382 years of existence, which, she reflected when they finally separated, was possibly exactly what she was. The tribunal concluded 6 weeks later with the permanent removal of Son, Vale, and Mirok from the court of Verath. Son was stripped of his title under the same provision he had used against Leander, which had a poetic tidiness to it that Morvain delivered with a perfectly expressionless face during the formal announcement. And that made Clara press her lips together hard to keep from grinning in the gallery. Vale and Mirok accepted lesser sanctions in exchange for full cooperation with the tribunal's record, which Morvain accepted as useful if not satisfying. Leander was formally reseated on the inner council in Son's vacated position, which was not a consequence any of the three had planned for when they began their campaign to destroy him. It was a cold kind of justice, very old and very clean, the kind that does not celebrate itself but simply exists, settled and final. On the evening of the reseating, there was a formal reception in the Grand Hall of Vereth House, the kind of court event that Leander typically endured rather than enjoyed. Clara was present not in the service corridor or at the back of the room with a silver tray, but standing beside him in a deep blue dress that she had bought herself with no assistance and no court wardrobe budget, because she was not a court accessory but a person who had chosen to be here, and the difference mattered to her. She noticed, throughout the evening, that every vampire lord and lady who approached Leander to offer congratulations met her gaze briefly before settling their eyes on him, assessing her with the careful attention of people who dealt in power and recognized that the landscape had changed. She held each look without flinching and without aggression, just clear and present and entirely comfortable with what she was and where she was standing. An ancient lord with copper-streaked silver hair and eyes like polished amber introduced himself as Lord Theodrin Castle, an ally of Leander's from a neighboring court, and he took Clara's hand with old-world courtesy and said, "I have heard a great deal about you, Miss Wren." "I expect you have," she said. "The human who called a stripped Lord King and then filed the complaint that restored him," he said. The story has moved faster than correspondence in this community, which tells you something about how unusual it is. "It was not calculated for storytelling purposes," she said. "No," Theodrin said, and his amber eyes were warm with something that might have been approval. "That is precisely why it has become a story." He looked at Leander. "You have chosen well." "Belisar, I am aware," Leander said, and the warmth in his voice when he said it was not court-appropriate at all, and Clara felt it in the side of her where she was standing closest to him. Like a heat source she had oriented herself toward without quite deciding to. Later, when the reception had wound down, and the grand hall had emptied, and they were the last two people in a room full of dying candles, and the aftermath of formality, Leander removed his court jacket and draped it over a chair and looked at Clara across the long room with an expression that was entirely relaxed and entirely his. "That is done," he said. "For now," she said. "Courts are never entirely done." "Profoundly true," he said. "And yet tonight it is done, and I would like, if you have no objection, to simply stand here with you for a moment and not be responsible for anything." She crossed the room and stood beside him and looked at the high, arched ceiling of the grand hall and the darkening candles and the ancient stone walls that had stood through things neither of them would fully know. "You can do that," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into the side of him, into his cool steadiness and his quiet certainty, and they stood there in the emptying hall and said nothing for a while, which was one of the things she had always loved best about being with him. The silences were not empty. They were full of everything that did not need to be said because it was already understood. "What do you want?" he asked eventually. Not in the court sense, not in the sense of strategy or legal designation or political navigation. "What do you want, Clara?" She thought about it honestly. "I want a room with books," she said. "I want a window, even a small one. I want to continue learning things that may or may not be useful. I want mornings that are not urgent." She paused. "I want to be where you are. Not because I need you to protect me, though I have no objection to that, but because you are the most interesting person I have met in 28 years, and I suspect you will only become more interesting, and I intend to pay attention to every bit of it." He looked down at her, and his expression, in the low light of the dying candles, was the most open she had ever seen it, the composure present but permeable, like a window rather than a wall. "I have quarters in the East Wing that have been unused for 2 centuries, he said. "They have a significant number of rooms. Several of them have books, and at least 2 have windows." He paused. "I have been thinking about asking you to consider making use of them." "As citizen," she said. "Absolutely not," he said with a definitiveness that was so immediate and so firm that it startled a laugh out of her, and he looked at her laugh with the same expression he had produced the first time she laughed in front of him. Like something had been switched on that he had not known was off. "As your companion," she said. "As the person I love," he said. "Which supersedes every other designation, legal or otherwise." She reached up and straightened the collar of his shirt, which did not need straightening, because it was an excuse for her hands to be near him, and he watched her do it with absolute patience and something in his eyes that looked very much like a man who had found exactly what he had been looking for, and had no intention of being careless with it. "All right," she said. "Show me the rooms." He offered his arm in the old-world way, and she took it in the very modern way of a woman who was choosing rather than following. And they walked together out of the grand hall, and through the corridors of Vereth House and up to the east wing, where the rooms were large and quiet, and full of the kind of old-world silence that felt like peace rather than emptiness. The first room they came to had 3 walls of bookshelves, and a window that overlooked the hidden courtyard below, where the court's private garden grew in careful, deliberate order, black-leaved hedges and silver flowers that bloomed in lamplight rather than sunlight. Clara stood at the window and looked down at it, and felt the whole strange, long, improbable road of the last weeks arrange itself behind her into something that made a kind of deep sense, the sense of a thing that was supposed to happen. "Do you like it?" Leander asked. He was standing just behind her, close enough that she could feel the quiet presence of him, that particular quality of attention that meant he was watching her with his whole self. "I love it," she said. "The window faces away from sunlight," he said. "I arranged all the East Wing rooms for that purpose, some years ago. It was a practical matter." She turned and looked at him. "It was a practical matter," she said. "And also," he said quietly, "I liked the courtyard. I found it had a certain quality of peace." He paused. "I have spent the last several decades finding it easier to be in spaces I made for my own comfort rather than for court presentation." He looked at the room around them. "This is mine. This is not the court's. I would like it to be yours, too, if you are willing." She stepped toward him until they were close, and she put her hand on his chest over the front of his shirt, over the still, quiet place where a human would have a heartbeat, and where Leander had something else, some deep old stillness that was not absence but a different kind of presence. "I am willing," she said. He covered her hand with his and held it there, and his eyes were warm and certain and entirely present. "Clara Wren," he said, "you called me king when I had no kingdom. I want you to know that whatever I rebuild, whatever comes of this court and these titles and these ancient obligations, none of it means anything that you do not know about. None of it will happen without you." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to it again, the same gesture he had made in the library weeks ago, but different now because everything was different now, because they were different now. "I love you. I have loved you since before I was wise enough to know it, and I intend to spend a very significant portion of eternity making absolutely certain that you know that." She felt tears at the edges of her eyes, which she did not fight because she had decided some years ago that crying was not weakness. It was the body responding to things that mattered. "I love you too," she said. "I have loved you since you stepped between me and those guards with no title and no authority and told them you still had your fangs." He made a sound that was genuine. Unguarded laughter, the first time she had heard him laugh fully, and it transformed him in a way that made her breath catch, made him look like all of the centuries, and the gravity and the responsibility he carried fell away for a moment, and underneath them was a person, her person, alive and present and laughing in the lamplight of a room full of books. She laughed too, and it mingled with his in the quiet old space, and the sound of it filled the room and settled into the walls, alongside everything else that had lived here, all the careful, private solitude of his centuries, now joined by something new and warm and entirely theirs. Outside, the city moved in its modern, unknowing way, traffic and lights and human lives proceeding in cheerful ignorance of the court beneath it, the ancient laws and the restored lord and the human woman who had called him king. The world did not know and did not need to know. Some things are complete in themselves, contained in the people who live them, requiring no audience and no record beyond the ones that matter. Morvain came the following morning to find Leander at breakfast, which was unusual for a formal court figure, and which told Clara, who was present at the table with tea and a book, that whatever he had come to say was personal rather than official. He greeted her with a respectful inclination of his head that she returned, and then he looked at Leander with his colourless, frosted eyes. "There is something I did not tell you during the review period," he said, "because the timing was not right, and because it was not directly relevant to the legal proceedings. I should like to tell you now. Leander set down his cup. Tell me. I knew what you were doing, Morvain said. The meetings with the human operative. I knew before the charges were filed. I was monitoring the situation. A pause. I allowed the proceedings to advance further than I should have before intervening, because I was building a case against Son's faction that required their full overreach to be legally actionable. I needed them to go all the way before I could move. He looked at Leander steadily. I used your situation strategically. I owe you the acknowledgement of that. Leander was quiet for a moment. Clara watched him consider this, watched the old-world intelligence behind his eyes, assess what it meant and what it required of him. You used it, he said finally, and in doing so, you removed a cancer from this court that would otherwise have continued for another century at minimum. He paused. I cannot fault the strategy, You can fault the personal cost, Morvain said. The personal cost, Leander said, and his eyes moved to Clara with something in them that was not calculated or performed, just true, produced outcomes I would not have anticipated and would not trade. He looked back at Morvain. Consider the debt discharged. Morvain nodded, and something in his ancient face that Clara thought might be relief settled quietly into place. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it is worth, he said, addressing them both. I have served this court for 400 years. I have witnessed many things I believed could not be witnessed. The sight of a human woman standing in the back of the chamber of judgment, alone and calling a stripped lord by his rightful title. He paused. I will carry that one for a very long time. He inclined his head once more and left them. Clara looked at Leander across the breakfast table. He was looking at her with the full settled warmth that she had come to understand was his at-peace expression, the one he did not show in public because it required a safety he had not felt in a long time. You were there with a silver tray, he said. I was, she said, and a heart considerably braver than is strictly advisable. Advisable never interested me very much, she said. I find honest more useful. He reached across the table and took her hand, easy and unhurried, the gesture of someone who has stopped being careful about what he wants because he has already decided, and the decision has settled into permanence. Then stay, he said. Stay, and be honest with me. Stay and notice things and tell me what you find. Stay and drink tea in rooms full of books and argue with me about court procedure and call me king when the world tells me I am nothing. He held her hand and held her gaze. Stay. Clara looked at the man across the table from her. This ancient, careful, certain person who had been lonely for so long that he had mistaken the loneliness for solitude. And she thought about everything that had brought them here, every impractical, brave, foolish, honest thing, and she understood with absolute clarity that it had all been leading to precisely this moment, precisely this table, precisely this hand warm in her own, precisely this question. I am already staying, she said. I have been staying for some time. You simply did not know it yet. He smiled then, fully and without reservation, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, that smile on his face, belonging to her, belonging to them, belonging to everything that had been built in the weeks of fire and old law and careful courage. It was a smile that had waited 382 years to have a reason, and she intended to give it reasons every day for as long as she was alive to do so. The court of Verath resumed its ancient rhythms in the months that followed, as courts always do. There were hearings and councils and old-world ceremonies and the slow, deliberate grinding of vampire politics, and Leander moved through all of it with the authority of a restored lord who had been tested and had not broken. He was different now, in ways that the court noticed and the court could not entirely name. He was still precise and still controlled, and still carried that ancient dangerous grace that made lesser vampires step aside when he moved through a corridor. But there was something in him now that had not been there before, some warmth that settled in around the edges of his formality, a quality of being known and knowing in return that changed the whole texture of his presence. Clara moved through the court differently too, though her role had changed considerably. She did not polish the silver anymore, not because she was above it, but because Leander had, with quiet firmness, arranged for the household staff to be restructured in a way that did not require his companion to perform tasks that had been assigned before her position was recognized. She had some opinions about this, which she shared clearly, and he had some responses which he delivered with equal clarity, and they had arrived at an arrangement that satisfied them both, which was that she was free to do any work she chose, within or outside the court, and he would not interfere with her choices, but he also was not going to pretend that her legal status had not changed, because it had and it mattered. She spent much of her new freedom with the court library, which was vast and poorly organized, and in need of someone who found that kind of systematic problem genuinely interesting. She catalogued and cross-referenced and built an index that had not existed before, and that proved immediately useful to the court's legal researchers. She made herself useful in the way she had always made herself useful, by paying attention to what was needed and doing it well, except now she did it from a position that was chosen rather than precarious. Leander watched her work when he was not occupied with council matters, and she could feel his attention even when she was not looking at him, that particular quality of someone who sees you fully and finds what they see endlessly sufficient. It was, she thought, the greatest gift of being truly loved. Not the grand gestures, though those had their place. Not the old-world courtesies, though she had developed a genuine fondness for those, but the dailiness of it, the ordinary repeated fact of being seen and being stayed for. Every day the choice renewed, every day the staying confirmed. There was a morning, some months after the Restoration, when the court was quiet and the east wing was full of winter light, slanted and blew through the windows, and Leander was reading at the long library table, and Clara was working at her cataloguing desk nearby, and there was no urgency, and no danger, and no ancient law requiring navigation. Just the two of them in a room full of books with tea cooling at their elbows, and the silence between them that was full of everything good. Leander looked up from his reading and found her looking at him, which she did not try to hide. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I am paying attention." He looked at her for a long moment, grey eyes warm and entirely certain. "What have you noticed?" he said. She thought about it. "That this is the life," she said. "This exactly as it is. Not any past version of it and not some future perfected arrangement. This right now." She held his gaze. "I wanted you to know that I am aware of it, that I am not waiting for the next thing. I am here." He closed his book. He looked at her across the room with the full weight of everything he was, old and careful and dangerous and devoted, and he said, "So am I," and they were. They were here together, in the life they had built from the rubble of betrayal and the courage of a woman with a silver tray, and 3 words that had changed everything. The court went on around them, and the ancient laws held their old shape, and the world beyond the hidden doors continued its unknowing modern life. But inside the east wing, in the room with 3 walls of books and a window overlooking the silver-flowered garden, there was something that did not require a title or a designation or a legal record to be exactly and completely what it was. It was love. It was the kind that survives the stripping away of everything else, and is found at the bottom of all that loss, still present and still true. It was the kind that a human woman calls across a silent chamber when every other voice has gone quiet. It was the kind that steps in front of danger with nothing left to offer but itself, and says, "This far and no further, not for me, for her." It was the kind that lasts, and so they lasted together in the days and months and years that followed. Improbable and complete, a human woman and an ancient lord. 2 people who had found in each other exactly the kind of company that made the long hours of a complicated life feel simply and entirely like home.